Hi. I'd like to introduce my part of my thesis. This is an ongoing work on my master's thesis on Sur, Masakin, informal settlement on Sur, with the help of Professor Fawaz and Professor Amar Abdelaziz. To start with, I'd like to agree on something. I'm going to use the word community, which we had started talking about yesterday. So just to mention one thing, that while using this word, I do not mean that it means a group of homogeneous people who share a lot of common things or have agreement on a lot of things. Basically, after working in Masakin al-Sha'biyya and Sur, what community means here is neighbors who share very limited things, actually, with a lot of diversity and a lot of differences. So locating the Masakin al-Sha'biyya, it's in Sur. It's on the edge of Sur, in the southern city. Searching to see when was it really built, we could only find pictures starting in 1956, where nothing was there, until 1975, where we see in the pink square, where we see the masakin are there. So, because I found nothing in the maps, I started to search for stories from people. While searching for a truth, for the reality of what happened, I actually bumped into interesting narratives which told me how people tried through stories to tell us why and how they see themselves and their occupation of the land as legal. So the story that most people tell is that in the beginning of 1975, there was a lot of problems. Yeah, I mean, the civil war had started in Lebanon. So stories about Palestinians fleeing from the fights in Beirut started, and people had to occupy these housing. I'm sorry. I had to tell you why did it start. So this is this city of Sur, and this is the old city, and this is the new city. And as you see, it's the biggest part of Sur has been excavated, so there was no place for people to build anymore. So one of the things is that the government decided to build in this place, which is a governmental land housing project for the citizens of the old city of Sur. So in 1975, the buildings were not over yet. People fearing that the Palestinians would come and occupy these unfinished buildings, ran and occupied them without being over yet, and they started building all around. And this is the yellow part is where the rest of the masakin was built. I tried to look at Sur now, and this is the city in orange. This is the old city, this is the new city. And the context of where Masakin al-Sha'biyya is. So you can see that the city has around 6 Palestinian camps around it. You have Al-Bas, you have Jal al-Bahr, Shabriha, you have Burj al-Shmali, Ma'shuq, and yes, Rashidiyya. With three Lebanese informal settlements, which is Bal'outa, Masakin, and Zira'a. 3 of the 6 Palestinian camps are informal. This one, and this one. So actually looking at the context, informality is not the exception. Informality is something that you see much more than the formal, accepted, mainstream form of building. Profiling Masakin, as I started by saying that dwellers from the old city of Sur started living in there and then building informally. Now the masakin is actually seen as the outcast because people, as we were talking yesterday about Ibn al-Mukhayyam and what does it mean, Ibn al-Masakin on the other hand means a thug because of the control of Harakat Amal in the area, people see that any problem that happens in Sur is probably caused by Ibn al-Masakin. Definitely because Harakat Amal and other political parties use the people of Masakin whenever there is a problem in Sur. They use them to stop or to start a problem, and then they use them again during the elections. So actually being illegal has added to the stigma of being a thug in Masakin. Looking at how Masakin looks like, going out from Sur to the eastern side, you are actually passing by a very unwelcoming industrial part of the town, which is formed by mechanicians and workshops. Just one block across inside of these workshops, you can find the housing of Masakin. And also you have at many points you have the workshops on the ground level and the houses on the first level. So inside, as I was saying, is a totally different typology. You find houses that totally look like the houses that you find in the neighboring southern villages, with a very strong religious and political presence of Harakat Amal and a minor one of Hezbollah. One of the major lands, one of the biggest occupied lands in Masakin is occupied by one of the responsible people in Harakat Amal who lives there. He had occupied it and turned it into a farmland. And for him, trying to legalize what he's doing, he showed me and allowed me to take pictures and took me around to see the unfarmed land. For him, squatting, occupying illegally, between brackets, squatting governmental lands, is much better than actually leaving the land like it is, leftover land that nobody actually gain anything from. Walking through Masakin is quite an interesting and diverse neighborhood. Part of it is the old governmental housing that I talked about, where the government tried to build courtyards and gardens within the houses. Since 2010, in 2010, one way or another, political parties all around Lebanon allowed their followers to start upon an informal, illegal building wave, which hit definitely Masakin, and 2 men were killed by the army when the army tried to stop it. You can see it was like totally non-stop, 24 hours. In a couple of weeks, the Masakin, which was mostly one-story neighborhood, turned into a 2 to 3-story neighborhood. And which actually threatened what is seen as an important component of Masakin, which we will see afterwards. The grids. Okay, so trying to understand what makes Masakin what it is, we tried to read it through the grids that govern it. We discovered that the first grid, which is made by the governmental housing. You can see the empty, the courtyard in the middle. The next one is the private grid made by Bal'outa, which is the adjacent neighborhood. An organic grid made by Ma'shu Hill, which is also a neighboring one. And another organic grid kind of being inspired by the Ma'shu one inside the Masakin. This is the Bal'outa. The Bal'outa is kind of informal because the land is a private land and it was sold by its owners, but then the amount of, the percentage of building per plot is illegal. So you can see it's not only the building form, it's also the relation to the public space, which is kind of different. This is inside the masakin, the relationship between the public housing and the outside. It's also pretty much blocked. And this is the informal housing, the organic grid in masakin. There's a lot of gardens, and at a lot of moments, this relationship between the inside and the outside, the private and the public, is pretty much broken. Dwelling. So we tried to analyze what works and what does not in masakin based on a lot of what Heidegger did. Heidegger worked basically on architecture in 3 basic works: The Thing, Poetically Man Dwells, and Building Dwelling Thinking. We can understand Heidegger's approach to building by just seeing this, the Building Dwelling Thinking title, where he did not actually put any punctuation between the words, meaning that building, dwelling, and thinking are the same. So going more into what Heidegger sees, he is talking about the appropriation of space and the relationship between people and their own spaces and how they grow with it and how they change it as a much more important factor and component for us to analyze how space is livable, successful, and how it's not, in a way. So this is how we tried to see what works and what does not. And based on the 2010 development, where most of the leftover gardens, spaces, and public-private spaces were totally devastated by the building wave, we tried to develop guidelines, very unstrict, very free guidelines that would allow the neighborhood to develop into the adjacent land plots in a form that would allow the people, the community itself, to decide on the way it will develop, and at the same time keep these factors, these components that would allow people to appropriate and to belong to the place. I'm taking here 3 grids as a comparison. The first one is more or less an orthogonal grid, this one. The second one is the public housing, and the third one is the more organic grid. Trying to see how it works on the ground, we saw that there is a hierarchy of private and public spaces that do not that are missed between the 3. So the first one we have, this is the public housing. You have the strictly, typically private house, and then you have when you open the door, you have nothing in between, you have no transition, you have directly to go into the public. The second one, which is this one, which is the newer one, where very few gardens have stayed, and mostly you have, which are the public-private places, and you have also the lack of transition. And this one, the organic grid, where you have 3 forms of spaces: the private, the public. The private and this is the private also, the semi-private, if you can call it, but it's different because it's your garden. It's the garden, but it's at the same time. We studied in a way the fences, where the fences are pretty much low, so the connection between the outside and the inside is different. People cannot enter, but people from inside, but there is visibility. And there is the D, which is the smaller pathways, the smaller alleyways, where it looks as if it's public, but actually whomever passes by, whomever just like goes through it, has a very high, is going through a very high level of observation, because people still see that the outside is a danger. So in masakin, these semi-public spaces are pretty much observed by people. The houses are most of the time open, the windows are open, so they can see who is passing by, who is walking around the house, even in the garden, the smaller the pathways around. This is kind of how we started to see the differences between them. we also are trying to understand the relationship and the differences between how do people see this transition between the outside and the inside, and how they change it themselves, either by levels or by fences and gates, or by gardens in between. Here you can see the newly, sorry. Yes. The more recent and much more developed kind of grid in Masakin, where the old intimacy has been lost, all the appropriation of space has been lost. It has become much more dense, much more urbanized, and much less fun to live in, actually. So this is it. Okay, I'd like to say one more thing. Because this is an unfinished, I'm still working on it. I had started a couple of years ago doing my research, stopped for a while, and then continued. A lot of my work has been ethnographic work in Masakin, and a lot of it has affected me in the way it had I had unlearned things I have learned and learned totally new things. So this is part of, I think, what our role as planners and as a researcher is. So that's it. Thank you.